The sun over the territory was not a gentle thing. It was a hammer, beating down on the cracked red earth until the heat shimmered in waves, distorting the horizon into a drunken, wobbling line. Dust was the region's lifeblood, a fine, rust-colored powder that coated everything, filling the air, catching in the throat, and settling in a gritty film on the hardtack and jerky that passed for a noon meal. It rose in ghostly plumes behind the occasional lone rider, a signal of life in a landscape that seemed dedicated to stillness and death. The hills were bald and scorched, dotted with the skeletal remains of sagebrush and the stubborn, twisted forms of juniper trees that clung to life with a miserly grip. The town of Redemption was little more than a collection of weathered, unpainted buildings huddled along a single dusty street, a name chosen with more hope than accuracy. There was a saloon with bat-wing doors that gasped open and shut in the hot wind, a general store whose windows were so caked with grime they seemed opaque, and a livery stable that smelled of dry hay and tired horses. Life here was pared down to its essentials. Survival was a victory, and joy was a luxury few could afford. The poverty wasn't spoken of. It was worn on the frayed cuffs of every shirt, in the sunken eyes of the women, and in the quiet, desperate way men nursed a single glass of whiskey for an hour. This was a land that took more than it gave, a place where softness went to die. And 10 miles out from this hub of weary existence, on a sprawling ranch that was too large for one man to work and too empty for one man to live in, was Silas. Silas was a man built to the scale of the land itself, vast, silent, and intimidating. He stood 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders as broad as an axe handle is long, and hands that could palm a calf's head. His hair was a thick, unruly thatch of dark brown, and his beard, untrimmed and threaded with gray, hid the hard line of his jaw. But it was his silence that people noticed most. It wasn't a peaceful quiet. It was a heavy, dense thing, a fortress he had built around himself brick by painful brick. He moved with a deliberate, lumbering grace, his footsteps falling with a thudding finality on the dry earth, each one seeming to cost him a great and terrible effort. He lived alone in a sturdy farmhouse he had built with his own 2 hands, a house that was now a hollow echo chamber for his grief. Inside, everything was meticulously clean, but devoid of life. The floors were swept, the simple wooden furniture free of dust, but there were no curtains on the windows, no rug on the floor, no scent of baking bread or brewing coffee. It was a shell, a place to sleep and eat, not to live. He rarely went into town, and when he did, it was with a singular purpose: to acquire the necessary supplies, flour, salt, cartridges, coffee, and retreat back to the solitude of his land. His nearest neighbors were miles away, and they kept their distance. They had their reasons, woven from a mixture of fear and pity. They remembered a different Silas, a man who, if not openly friendly, had at least been capable of a slow nod or a gruff word of greeting, a man with a wife, a man with a son. The memory, as it always did, came unbidden, a ghost that needed no invitation to cross his threshold. It had been 3 years, but time had done nothing to blunt the edges of the horror. It waited for him in the quiet moments, when he was mending a fence line under the relentless sun, or sitting at his empty supper table in the deepening twilight. It was the smell that brought it back first, the acrid scent of smoke, not the clean, woody smell of his hearth fire, but the greasy, foul stench of burning hay and pine and something else, something he refused to name. He had been in the far pasture, rounding up a stray calf, when he saw the column of black smoke clawing at the pristine blue sky. A cold dread, colder than any winter frost, had seized him. He had run, his powerful legs eating up the dry ground, his lungs burning, a single, desperate prayer repeating in his mind. Asterisk, not the barn. Please, God, not the barn. But it was the barn, the new one, the one he had been so proud of. its timbers still smelling of fresh-cut pine. His wife, Eleanor, had been inside, showing their 5-year-old son, Thomas, the new foal. The structure hadn't just burned. It had collapsed. A dry support beam, weakened by a hidden rot, had given way, bringing the hayloft down in a catastrophic instant. A tipped lantern had done the rest. By the time he arrived, it was an inferno. The roar was a living thing, a beast of orange and black. He could hear the screams of the trapped animals, a sound of pure terror that would echo in his nightmares for the rest of his days. But he couldn't hear Eleanor. He couldn't hear Thomas. He had plunged into the smoke, the heat searing his skin and scorching his lungs, screaming their names until his voice was a raw, useless rasp. He had tried to lift a fallen, blazing beam, his massive strength useless against the dead weight of the catastrophe. The flames had driven him back, licking at his clothes, his beard sizzling, his skin blistering. The sheriff and 2 other men had to physically drag him away, a giant roaring his grief and fury at a deaf and merciless God. He hadn't been able to save them. The thought was a brand on his soul. He, the man who could lift a wagon, who could break a wild stallion, had been rendered helpless. He had failed in the only way that truly mattered. He had outlived his world. After the fire, after the solemn, pitiful burial in the small churchyard, the silence had descended. He had rebuilt the barn, a grim, solitary penance, his hammer blows echoing across the empty valley. But he never set foot in the new structure that stood where the old one had fallen. It was a monument to his failure, a tombstone marking the grave of his life. The townsfolk of Redemption watched him from a distance. They saw his retreat into solitude not as a manifestation of grief, but as a descent into madness. His size, once a point of simple country admiration, now became menacing. His silence was no longer seen as contemplative, but as the brooding of a disturbed mind. Whispers followed him like his own shadow. Lost his senses when he lost his family, one would murmur to another over a cracker barrel at the general store. The Giant of Redemption Ridge, they called him, a name befitting a folklore monster. Keeps to himself, like a wounded bear. Mothers would gather their children close when his wagon rumbled into town, hushing them with warnings. You stay clear of Mr. Silas's property. You hear? It's not safe out there. The children, with their natural inclination for ghost stories, obeyed. The sprawling ranch at the edge of town became a place of dark legend, the lonely farmhouse a haunted castle, and Silas its resident ogre. They didn't see a man hollowed out by loss. They saw a giant, a madman, a creature to be feared and avoided. And Silas, in his profound isolation, did nothing to dissuade them. Their fear was another layer on the wall he had built, and in a way, he was grateful for it. It kept the world out, but the silence was a relentless enemy. It was a physical presence in the house, pressing in on him, filling the empty chairs, whispering with the voices of ghosts. For 3 years, he had endured it. He had worked until his muscles screamed for rest, hoping to exhaust himself into a dreamless sleep. But exhaustion was no match for memory. One evening, sitting in the oppressive quiet of his kitchen, the loneliness became an active, gnawing pain, worse than any physical ailment. It was a sickness of the soul. He wasn't afraid of being alone. He was afraid of being consumed by the emptiness. It was in that moment of quiet desperation that he made a decision. He couldn't resurrect the dead. He couldn't erase the past. But perhaps he could put something, someone, in the path of the encroaching silence. He remembered seeing an advertisement in a tattered, month-old newspaper from St. Louis, a matrimonial agency. Lonely bachelors of the West, find a God-fearing, hard-working bride to share your home and fortune. He had scoffed at it then. Fortune. His only fortune was acres of dust and a herd of cattle that barely paid for itself. And the idea of replacing Eleanor? It was a sacrilege. But he wasn't looking to replace her. He wasn't looking for love, or passion, or even affection. Those things were ash and dust. buried with his wife and child. He was looking for a barrier, a human presence to hold the ghosts at bay, a heartbeat in the house other than his own. With stiff, unpracticed fingers, he lit a lamp and sat at his table. The letter took him an hour to compose, his large hand cramping around the pen, the words stark and clumsy on the page. He wrote to the broker, Mr. Jedediah Croft, in St. Louis. He described his ranch honestly, omitting none of its hardships. He stated his situation plainly. A widower, 35 years of age. He made no pretense of a gentle nature or a cheerful disposition. I do not offer romance or a life of ease, he wrote, the nib of the pen scratching heavily on the paper. The work is hard and the land is unforgiving. I require only two things, honesty and a strong back. I have no time for delicate women or fanciful notions. In return, I can offer a roof, food, and my protection. He paused, searching for the right words to convey the truth of his need without revealing the raw wound beneath. Finally, he added the line that mattered most. Send me a woman who is brave enough to share a silence. He posted the letter the next day, along with a modest sum for the broker's fee, feeling a strange mix of shame and grim resolve. He expected no reply. What woman would agree to such a bleak proposal? He was offering a life sentence of hard labor and quiet misery. Weeks turned into a month, then 2. The brutal summer sun began to relent, its edge softened by the first hints of autumn. He had all but forgotten the letter, dismissing it as a fool's errand born of a moment of weakness. Then, the mail rider, on his weekly route, left a letter in the box at the end of his long, winding road. It was postmarked from St. Louis, the envelope thin and addressed in a surprisingly neat, feminine hand. He carried it back to the house, his heart thudding with a strange, unfamiliar rhythm. He sat at the table and slit it open with his skinning knife. Inside was a short note from the broker. Found a suitable match. Her letter is enclosed. And a smaller, folded piece of paper. He unfolded it. The script was the same as on the envelope. The letters precise and clear. Asterisk Mr. Silas. It began. Asterisk Mr. Croft has shown me your letter. I understand your terms. I have worked my entire life. I am not afraid of hardship. The silence you speak of is not unfamiliar to me. I will take the train west and arrive in Redemption on the 5th of October. Asterisk yours. Asterisk Clara. Asterisk. It was the sparest, most unadorned letter he could have imagined. No questions about his life. No description of her own. No hopes for the future. It was a simple acceptance of a contract. He was about to fold it, a sense of grim satisfaction settling over him, when he saw a small postscript at the very bottom of the page, written almost as an afterthought. P. Mr. Croft felt it his duty to inform you that I have a disfigurement, a scar on my face. He said I should be honest about it, so I will be. I am not beautiful, but I have survived. Silas read the last sentence 3 times. Asterisk survived asterisk. The word landed in the vast, echoing silence of his heart not as a whisper, but as a tolling bell. For a man haunted by those who hadn't, that single word was more compelling than any promise of beauty or pledge of affection could ever be. It was a word he understood. It was a piece of solid ground in a world that had turned to ash. He folded the letter, his massive, calloused fingers surprisingly gentle, and for the first time in 3 years, he looked out his window not at the ghosts of the past, but toward the horizon, and waited. The train arrived with a great sigh of steam and a groan of metal, a monstrous iron beast intruding upon the afternoon stupor of Redemption. Its whistle, a shrill and alien sound in the quiet air, had drawn a small, curious crowd to the weathered timber of the station platform. There was Mr. Abernathy, the station master, wiping his hands on an oily rag, a few dusty-looking ranch hands taking a break from the saloon, and a trio of women, their faces shaded by sunbonnets, who had paused on their way to the general store. their conversation dwindling to expectant whispers. When the passenger car door opened, only one person descended. She stood for a moment at the top of the steps, a small, still figure silhouetted against the dark interior of the car. The unforgiving afternoon sun struck her full on, and a collective, almost imperceptible intake of breath passed through the onlookers. Her dress was the color of weak tea, a faded calico that had been mended so many times at the elbows and hem that the original fabric was a mystery. It was clean, but utterly worn, a garment that had clearly seen years of hard service. In her hands, she clutched a battered carpet bag, its floral pattern almost entirely obscured by grime and wear, a length of twine wrapped around its middle to keep the broken latch closed. She was small-boned and thin, with dark hair pulled back in a severe, tight bun that seemed to pull at the very skin of her face. And then there was the scar. It was the first and only thing anyone truly saw, a jagged silvery line that ran from just below her left temple, down the curve of her cheek, and ending near the corner of her mouth. It wasn't a fresh wound, but an old, settled one, the kind that had become a permanent part of the landscape of her face. The scar tissue pulled the skin tight, tugging ever so slightly at the corner of her eye and lip, giving that side of her face a permanent, unnerving expression that was caught somewhere between sorrow and surprise. Clara descended the steps, her worn leather boots making a soft, dusty sound on the wooden platform. She kept her chin up, her gaze fixed on a point somewhere beyond the staring faces, a practiced defense against a world that had always looked at her this way. The whispers started immediately, a low, sibilant rustle like dry leaves skittering across the ground. "Look at her face. Good heavens. Mail order. I'd wager. Who else would come to a place like this? Must be for the giant. No one else would." The voices trailed off as she walked past, her focus singular. The instructions from the matrimonial agency had been clear. Proceed to the Redemption Hotel and await her intended. Her bag felt heavier than it was, weighted with the force of the stairs pressing in on her. She found the hotel easily enough, a 2-story false front building that looked like it was held up by its peeling paint. She pushed open the door and stepped into the dim, slightly cooler interior. A woman with a face as sharp and unforgiving as a shard of rock stood behind a long wooden counter, polishing a glass. She looked up, and her eyes, small and dark, immediately fixed on Clara's scar. The polishing cloth in her hand went still. "Help you?" the woman asked, her tone flat and unwelcoming. "I was told to wait here," Clara said, her voice softer than she intended, but steady. "For Mr. Silas." The mere mention of his name caused the woman's thin lips to tighten into a disapproving line. She gave Clara another long, slow look, taking in the worn dress, the makeshift luggage, and the scarred face. It was a look of appraisal, the kind one gives to livestock of questionable quality. "We're full up," the woman said, turning back to her glass, the statement a clear dismissal. Clara glanced around the empty lobby, a few dusty chairs, a sad-looking potted fern, a flight of stairs leading up into silence. It was plainly a lie. She understood. It wasn't about the room. It was about her. She was not the sort of person the proprietor wanted gracing her establishment. She had faced this kind of quiet, unarguable rejection before. It was a familiar, bitter taste. "I see," Clara said softly. "Thank you." She turned and walked back out into the oppressive heat, the door closing behind her with a note of finality. There was nowhere else to go. She stood by the horse trough at the edge of the street, placing her bag carefully on the dry ground beside her. She didn't sit. She simply stood, a solitary island in the river of dust, and waited. The sun beat down, turning the pins in her hair to hot needles against her scalp. The onlookers, having seen the brief, silent drama of her rejection, now kept their distance, content to watch the strange, scarred woman who had come for the town's resident monster. She stood there for what felt like an eternity, the sun beginning its slow descent towards the scorched hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and bruised purple. And then she heard it, the slow, rhythmic creak of wagon wheels and the heavy tread of a large horse, a buckboard wagon, old and weathered, its wood bleached nearly white by the sun, came up the street, pulled by a single, massive draft horse. The man holding the reins was as immense as the horse. It was Silas. He pulled the wagon to a halt a few feet from her. The lingering whispers on the street died completely. Doors that had been ajar were quietly pulled shut. Silas wrapped the reins around the brake handle and climbed down. He moved with a heavy deliberation, his worn boots sinking into the thick dust. He was even larger than she had imagined from the town's reaction, a true giant of a man, his shoulders blocking out a wide portion of the setting sun. He stopped in front of her, his eyes, a startlingly clear gray under the shadow of his hat brim, met hers. She braced herself for the flinch, the quick glance away, the flicker of pity or disgust she had seen in the eyes of 1,000 other strangers. But it never came. His gaze was steady, direct, and unnervingly calm. He looked at her face, his eyes moving over it with a kind of detached appraisal. He saw the scar, of course. He took it in, noted it, as he might note a brand on a cow or a crack in a rock. It was a fact, a feature of the landscape before him. And then, just as calmly, his gaze moved on, meeting her eyes directly. He did not look away. In that single, simple act of not flinching, he offered her more decency than she had received from the entire town combined. "Miss Clara?" he asked. His voice was a low rumble, like distant thunder, a sound that seemed to come from deep within his chest. "Mr. Silas," she replied, her voice a fragile counterpoint to his. He gave a single, curt nod. His eyes dropped to the battered carpetbag at her feet. Without another word, he bent down, his huge frame seeming to fold in on itself, and lifted the bag as if it weighed nothing at all. He tossed it into the back of the buckboard, where it landed with a soft thud. "The ride is long," he said. It wasn't an apology, just a statement of fact. He gestured to the wagon seat. He helped her up, his hand briefly taking her elbow. His touch was firm, impersonal, and surprisingly gentle. She settled herself on the hard wooden bench, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her back ramrod straight. He climbed up beside her, the wagon groaning under his weight, and with a soft click of his tongue, he set the horse into a slow, plodding walk. They rode out of Redemption in a heavy silence, leaving the staring, judgmental town behind them. As the last of the buildings receded, the true nature of the land revealed itself to Clara. It was a world of harsh, breathtaking emptiness. The road was little more than 2 ruts carved into the red earth. They passed through stands of lightning-charred pines, their blackened, skeletal fingers clawing at the sky. The grass on either side of the road was the color of ash, brittle and dry. The only sound was the rhythmic creak of the wagon's axles, the soft plodding of the horse's hooves in the dust, and the occasional, mournful caw of a crow circling high overhead. The silence in the wagon was as vast as the landscape. Clara did not speak, uncertain what to say, and Silas seemed a man to whom words did not come easily. He kept his eyes on the road ahead, his large, calloused hands holding the reins with a practiced ease. "That's Black Creek," he rumbled once, pointing with his chin toward a deep, dry ravine snaking through the land. "Runs dry in August?" "I see," she said. Another mile passed in silence. "Coyotes get bold this time of year," he offered, his gaze scanning the dusky hills. "Keep the chickens penned up tight." "Yes, Mr. Silas." She stared out at the unforgiving terrain, a landscape so alien to the crowded, grimy streets of St. Louis that it might as well have been the moon. There was a terrible beauty to it, a stark and lonely grandeur, but it was an intimidating beauty, one that promised no comfort, no softness. She felt a knot of apprehension tighten in her stomach. She had survived so much: neglect, cruelty, a fire that had nearly claimed her life and had marked her forever. But she wondered, in that moment, if she had what it took to survive this profound and crushing emptiness. Just as true darkness began to settle, he turned the horse off the main road and onto a barely there track that led up a low rise. At the top, hunkered down against the vast emptiness of the sky, was the ranch. It was a simple, sturdy-looking farmhouse, flanked by a large barn and several smaller outbuildings. There were no trees near the house, no garden, no sign of any life other than the thin curl of smoke rising from the stone chimney. It was a fortress of solitude. He pulled the wagon to a halt near the porch. "We're here." He helped her down, then retrieved her bag. As she stood on the porch, she could feel the sheer, oppressive scale of the silence. There were no city sounds, no distant neighbors, only the whisper of the wind through the dry grass and the chirping of crickets. She felt impossibly small, a tiny speck in an overwhelming void. She took a deep breath, steeling herself, her expression remaining placid. Silas watched her, his gray eyes missing nothing. He saw the slight tremor in her hands, but he also saw the resolve in the set of her jaw. She did not look afraid. He pushed the door open and stood aside for her to enter. The inside of the house was as stark as the outside. It was scrupulously clean, but bare. A large stone fireplace dominated the main room, flanked by a single, heavily built armchair. A simple wooden table and 2 chairs sat in the middle of the floor. There were no pictures on the walls, no books on the shelves, no warmth. It was the home of a man who had forgotten how to live. "The kitchen is through there," he said, gesturing. "You can put your things in here for now." He led her down a short hall to a closed door. He pushed it open, revealing a small bedroom, a simple iron bed frame with a neatly folded quilt, a small wooden dresser, and a washstand with a pitcher and bowl were the only furnishings. The air was stale, as if the room had been closed up for a long time. He set her bag down by the foot of the bed. They stood for a moment in the awkward silence, the small room seeming to shrink around his large frame. Clara waited, her heart beating a little faster. This was the moment of truth, the moment when the terms of their strange bargain would be truly tested. Silas cleared his throat, the sound rough in the quiet. He didn't look at her, but at a dark knot in the wooden floorboards. "This will be your room," he said, his voice low. "The house is quiet." He finally lifted his head, and his gray eyes met hers. They were filled with a profound weariness, a sadness so deep it seemed to have settled into his very bones. "You're safe here, Clara," he said, and the words were a solemn vow. "I'll not ask anything of you, nothing you don't offer freely. All I expect is respect and honesty." He held her gaze for a second longer, ensuring she understood. Then he gave another of his short, curt nods. "I'll be outside," he said, and turning, he left the room, closing the door softly behind him, leaving her alone. Clara stood motionless in the center of the room, listening as his heavy footsteps faded away. The latch clicked as the front door closed. She was alone, in a strange house, in the middle of an immense and empty land, with a giant of a man she did not know, but for the first time in a very, very long time. She was not afraid. He had not offered her comfort, or kindness, or love. He had offered her something far more rare and infinitely more valuable. He had offered her safety. She walked to the bed and placed a hand on the rough, clean fabric of the quilt. The silence was still there, vast and deep, but for the first time, it did not feel like a threat. It felt like a space waiting to be filled. The first days at the ranch unfolded in a rhythm of relentless, repetitive labor. For Clara, it was a language she understood. Life was a series of tasks, a mountain of chores to be scaled between sunrise and sunset. The silence of the house was not empty. It was filled with the sounds of her work, the scrape of the broom on the rough-hewn floorboards, the rhythmic thump of the butter churn, the sizzle of salt pork in a hot skillet. She learned the temperament of the black iron wood stove, a cantankerous beast that demanded to be fed small, seasoned pieces of juniper at just the right intervals, rewarding her with a steady heat for baking dense, hearty bread, or punishing her with plumes of acrid smoke for a moment's inattention. She learned the heft of the water buckets, drawing them up from the deep, stone-lined well, her shoulders and back protesting at first, then slowly hardening to the task. The water was cold and clean, with a mineral taste of the deep earth, a luxury she did not take for granted. She learned to mend Silas's work shirts, thick canvas garments that were perpetually torn or frayed. The needle was thick and the thread was coarse, and she pushed it through the heavy fabric with a thimble-worn finger, her small, neat stitches, a stark contrast to the rugged material. In the quiet hours of the afternoon, she would sit on the porch, a basket of mending in her lap, and feel the immense, unblinking gaze of the sun and the sky. The West, she was discovering, was not a place but a presence. It was in the constant, sighing wind that carried the scent of dust and dry pine. It was in the hawks that circled on unseen currents high overhead, their shadows drifting over the parched land. It was a harsh, demanding existence that stripped away all that was unnecessary, leaving only the essential framework of survival. And in that stripping away, she found a strange and quiet peace. Here, there were no false pleasantries, no veiled insults. The land was honest in its brutality. It would kill you with heat, or cold, or thirst, but it would not lie to you. She and Silas moved around each other like two planets in a silent, predictable orbit. Their mornings were marked by the smell of coffee he brewed, strong and black, before heading out to the pastures at first light. Their evenings were marked by the simple, hearty meal she would have waiting for him when he returned, his large frame filling the doorway, bringing with him the scent of horse, leather, and sweat. Their conversations were brief and practical, navigational charts for the day's work. The hen in the corner coop looks ready to sit. I'll gather the eggs. We're low on flour. I'll make a note for when you next go to town. They existed in a state of respectful distance. He never entered her room. She never presumed to tidy the sparse collection of his personal belongings on the mantelpiece, a whetstone, a tin of tobacco, a single, polished river rock. They were two solitary people sharing a roof, a silent truce between them. But Clara was an observer. Her survival had depended on her ability to watch, to understand the moods and habits of those more powerful than herself. And she watched Silas. She noticed things. She saw the way his eyes, so often hard and distant when looking at the horizon, would soften when he ran a hand down the muzzle of his old gray horse. Gideon. She saw the way his massive hands, which could wrestle a steer to the ground, could also move with surprising delicacy to reset the wing of a fallen chickadee. And there were two things she noticed that spoke of the deep, unhealed wound within him. The first was the new barn, the one that stood 100 yards from the house. It was a fine, sturdy structure, yet in all the weeks she had been there, she had never seen him set foot inside it. He would walk up to it, sometimes, his steps slowing as he drew near, and he would stand there for a long moment, his hand resting on the large wooden door, his shoulders slumped. He would stand like a man before a tomb, and then, with a visible effort, he would turn and walk away, his face set like granite. She did not know the story of that barn, but she knew it was a place haunted by more than just dust motes. The second was his evening ritual. After he had eaten, after he had cleaned his plate and pushed his chair back from the table, he would walk outside. He would go to a lone, ancient ponderosa pine that stood on a small rise overlooking the western valley. There, he would sit, not on the ground, but on a large, flat rock at its base, his back against the rough bark, and he would watch the sun set. He never missed it. He would sit there, a great, unmoving silhouette against the dying light, as the sky bled from brilliant orange and crimson to deep purple and finally to a velvet, star-dusted black. He was not admiring the beauty. She knew that instinctively. It was a vigil, a silent, daily communion with his ghosts. From the kitchen window, Clara would watch him, and she would feel a pang of something she could not name. It was not pity, it was recognition. She, too, knew what it was to be haunted. Her own ghosts were never far away. They came to her in the quiet moments before sleep, or were triggered by the scent of wood smoke, the sudden clang of a dropped pot. Her past was a landscape as scarred as her face. She remembered her foster father, Mr. Finch, a man whose kindness was a thin veneer over a core of casual cruelty. He was a man of quiet, simmering resentments, and she had been the most convenient target for them. His words had been blows, his silence a threat. She had learned to make herself small, to move through the house like a mouse, to anticipate his moods and navigate his simmering anger. The fire had been his final act of carelessness. Drunk on cheap whiskey, he had stumbled, knocking over the kerosene lamp. She remembered the scene in flashes of terror, the roar as the flames licked up the dry curtains, the suffocating black smoke, his drunken shouts, not of concern for her, but of rage at his own clumsiness. She had been trapped in her small attic room. The heat had been a living thing, searing her lungs, the smoke a choking blanket. Survival had been a single, desperate act, wrapping her thin nightgown around her head. She had thrown her small wooden chair through the window, the shattering glass a song of escape. She had climbed out, cutting herself on the shards, and dropped 15 feet to the hard-packed earth below. She had landed badly, her arm breaking with a sickening crack, the side of her face scraping against the rough clapboard wall of the house on her way down. But she had gotten out. He had not. The scar was her reminder. It was the price she had paid for her life, and it, along with the memories, had taught her one indelible lesson: to never trust a man. Men, in her experience, were takers. Their touch was a claim, their provision a debt, their kindness a down payment on a future demand. This was why Silas was such a profound and unsettling mystery. He asked for nothing. He took nothing. He was a constant, steady presence, as reliable and undemanding as the sunrise. And there was the matter of his gaze. She was accustomed to the way men looked at her. They would either stare openly at her scar, their eyes filled with a morbid curiosity, or they would pointedly look away, a gesture of politeness that was, in its own way, just as insulting. Silas did neither. His eyes, when they fell upon her, never lingered on her face. At first, she thought he was simply avoiding looking at her scar, like all the others. But then, one afternoon, as she sat at the kitchen table kneading a great mound of dough for the week's bread, she looked up and found him standing in the doorway, watching her. He had come back for a canteen he'd forgotten, but he had stopped, his purpose momentarily forgotten. She froze, her hands buried to the wrists in the sticky dough, waiting for the familiar, uncomfortable dance of his eyes. But his gaze wasn't on her face, it was on her hands. He watched her hands as they worked, pushing and folding and turning the dough with an efficient, practiced strength. He looked at her fingers, chapped and reddened from the harsh lye soap. He saw the split fingernails, the small, pale scar on her right knuckle where she'd slipped with a paring knife the week before. He was not looking at her disfigurement. He was looking at her labor. He was seeing her strength, her competence, her endurance. He was seeing the parts of her that had allowed her to survive. In his quiet, steady gaze, she felt not judgment or pity, but a profound and unspoken respect. The realization settled deep within her, a single drop of warmth in a frozen sea. It was the first time a man had looked at her and seen not what had been done to her, but what she could do. That small moment was a turning point. A tiny seed of trust had been planted. From it, their conversations began to grow, slowly and cautiously, like the stubborn wildflowers that push their way through the cracked earth after a rare rain. They remained rooted in the practical, but they began to branch out. One evening, as he cleaned his rifle, he spoke into the silence. "The north pasture is looking thin. Needs a good rain. My grandmother used to say a ring around the moon means rain is coming soon," she replied softly, not looking up from her sewing. He grunted, a sound that might have been agreement. The next night, he noticed the ring around the moon and pointed it out to her. He began to talk about his horse. "Gideon, he's getting old," Silas said one afternoon, watching the gray horse drink slowly from the trough. "Got a bad limp in his foreleg when the air gets cold. A warm mash with a little molasses might soothe him," she suggested. He tried it. It seemed to help. The sunsets, which had been his solitary ritual, slowly became something shared. He would still sit under his pine tree, but now, when he came back inside, he would speak of it. "Sky was red tonight," he'd observe, his voice a low rumble. "Sailor's warning," she'd whisper, almost to herself, and they would sit in a silence that was no longer empty, but filled with the shared image of the crimson sky. One night, weeks later, the rain he had wished for finally came. It did not arrive gently. It came as a furious, violent assault. The sky, which had been clear an hour before, turned a bruised, greenish black. The wind rose to a howl, throwing dust and loose twigs against the windows like a spray of buckshot. The first clap of thunder was a cannon blast that seemed to shake the very foundations of the small house. Clara, who had been about to retire to her room, stopped, her hand on the doorknob. The lantern on the kitchen table flickered wildly in the draft. Rain began to lash against the glass, thick, heavy drops that sounded like pebbles. Another boom of thunder, closer this time, was followed by a flash of lightning that bleached the world white for a heart-stopping second. The front door opened and Silas came in, bringing a gust of wind and rain with him. He was soaked, his hat dripping, his broad shoulders dark with water. He shut the door, plunging the room into a sudden, muffled quiet. The roar of the storm, now a beast clawing at the walls. "It's a bad one," he stated, pulling off his wet hat. He moved to the large stone hearth in the main room, a space they rarely used. He knelt, his large frame easily handling the heavy logs, and within minutes he had a fire crackling to life. The flames leapt up, casting a warm, dancing light across the room, pushing back the encroaching darkness. He looked over at her, still standing uncertainly by the door to the hall. "No sense sitting in the dark," he said, his voice softer than usual, almost gentle. "Come sit by the fire." It was an invitation, the first he had ever truly offered, hesitantly. She moved from the kitchen and into the main room, taking a seat in the straight-backed chair opposite his large armchair. The fire popped and hissed, a cheerful, domestic sound at odds with the fury of the storm raging outside. The flickering, golden light was different from the harsh, interrogating light of the sun. It was a kinder light. It softened the hard lines of the room, and it softened the hard lines on their faces. It threw the planes of Silas's face into sharp relief, highlighting the deep-set weariness in his eyes, the grief carved into the lines around his mouth, and it touched Clara's face with a gentle hand, turning the silver of her scar into a trace of moonlight, making the shadows on her cheek seem less like damage and more like a secret depth. They sat without speaking for a long time, watching the flames. The storm raged, but inside their small bubble of firelight, there was a profound and unexpected peace. For the first time, they were not just a man and a woman coexisting in a house. They were two people, sitting together, sharing a small warmth against a great and terrible storm. And in the dancing firelight, each of them saw, for the first time, the full and unvarnished truth of the other's sorrow. The heavy silence that had followed the storm did not retreat. Instead, it changed its nature. It was no longer the empty, echoing silence of two strangers in a cavernous grief, but a quieter, more contemplative silence, filled with the unspoken awareness of the other's presence. The night by the fire had forged a fragile truce, a recognition that they were aligned not against each other, but against the vast, lonely world outside the farmhouse walls. With this unspoken shift, something began to stir in Clara. It was a quiet, determined nesting instinct, the impulse to impose a small measure of order in life onto the starkness of her surroundings. She did not ask for permission. She simply began. Her first project was the patch of sun-scalded earth behind the house that might have once been a garden. She found a rusted spade and a three-pronged cultivator in the back of a dusty shed. The ground was as hard as brick, and the work was punishing. For days, she did little more than break the soil, her small frame straining against the unyielding earth, her hands blistering despite being wrapped in rags. Silas watched her from a distance as he went about his own chores. He saw the sweat on her brow, the stubborn set of her jaw. He said nothing. He did not offer to help, sensing this was a battle she needed to wage on her own terms. But one morning, she woke to find a heavy, sharpened mattock leaning against the porch rail, a tool far better suited to the task. It had not been there the night before. No words were exchanged, but the message was clear. He saw her. He understood. Slowly, miraculously, the patch of dead earth began to transform. Under the baked crust, the soil was dark and rich. She planted what she could find, a few sprouting potatoes from the root cellar, some onion sets she had carefully saved, and seeds for hardy herbs, thyme and sage, that she had brought with her in a small cloth pouch. The work was a prayer, each seed a small act of faith planted in a desolate land. Her campaign against the dust and disuse of the past moved indoors. One bright, windy morning, she stripped the heavy wool blankets from Silas's bed. They were thick with the dust of years, smelling of cold embers and loneliness. She spent the entire day hauling water from the well, scrubbing the blankets in a large wooden wash tub with harsh lye soap until her arms ached and her knuckles were raw. She hung them on the long fence line, and the wind, that constant restless voice of the prairie, snapped and billowed through them, whipping away the last vestiges of sorrow and leaving behind only the clean, honest scent of sun and soap. That night, when Silas climbed into bed, the unfamiliar freshness, the simple comfort of a clean blanket, was a quiet revelation, a comfort so long forgotten it felt entirely new. She began to explore the landscape around the ranch, not as a threat, but as a larder. She found wild chamomile growing in a sheltered ravine and clusters of mint near the creek bed. She gathered the blossoms and leaves, drying them in the warm kitchen. In the evenings, she would brew a simple tea. The first time she offered a cup to Silas, he looked at the pale, fragrant liquid with suspicion. "What is it?" he'd rumbled. "Just chamomile, to help with sleep," she'd said. He took the cup, his large, calloused fingers wrapping around the warm tin, and drank. It was a small, gentle thing in a life that had been anything but. It became another of their silent rituals. Her final, most personal touch was a small square of bleached flour sacks she had saved. With fine, dark thread, she embroidered a simple spray of bluebells on it, a flower she remembered from a life long past. It was a useless, beautiful thing. She hemmed the edges and hung the small, delicate handkerchief over the kitchen window, securing it with 2 tacks. It did little to block the harsh light, but it softened it, filtering the relentless glare through the image of impossible blue flowers. It was a tiny flag of defiance, a declaration that even here, a small space could be made for grace. These quiet changes did not go unnoticed by the outside world. The territory was sparsely populated, but news traveled on the wind. A neighboring rancher, Mr. Henderson, a man with a weathered face and curious eyes, rode by one day in search of a stray steer. He saw her, a small figure in a faded dress, kneeling in her burgeoning garden, and tipped his hat. That was all it took. By the next Sunday gathering outside the clapboard church in Redemption, the whispers had begun. Henderson says the giant has a woman out there now. The one that came on the train. The one with the, you know." A hand would gesture vaguely to a cheek. "What in God's name does a man like that want with a damaged thing like her? He could have his pick of sturdy widows." Maybe he figures she won't complain, grateful for any roof over her head. I'd wager the gossip was a noxious weed, rooted in ignorance and fertilized by boredom. Clara was no longer a person. She was a curiosity, a problem to be solved, her scar a text to be interpreted. Her presence at the ranch was an affront to the natural order of things in their small, circumscribed world. The whispers found their voice on their next trip into town. It had been over a month, and their supplies were critically low. The ride in was tense. Clara could feel the weight of what was coming. She wore her plainest dress and pulled her hair back so tightly it hurt, as if a severe appearance could serve as armor. As they walked down the main street towards the general store, a hush fell. Windows seemed to develop eyes. Porch conversation stuttered and died. Inside the store, the air was thick with unspoken judgment. The proprietor, Mr. Davies, a thin, weasel-faced man with spectacles perched on his nose, greeted Silas with a practiced, oily politeness that did not extend to Clara. He looked past her, through her, as if she were a pane of dirty glass. Clara moved quietly through the store, gathering what they needed: flour, coffee, beans, a slab of bacon. She spoke in a low voice, her requests directed at the floor. "A sack of flour, please. Half a pound of coffee." "Mr. Davies," answered Silas, but his eyes, glittering with malice, were on Clara. "Getting a taste for the finer things. Are we, Silas?" he asked, his voice slick with insinuation as he weighed out the coffee beans. "Usually you just stick to the basics." Silas's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Clara's face burned with shame. She placed a small tin of cinnamon on the counter, a rare treat she had hoped to use for baking. Davies let out a small, derisive sniff. He looked directly at Clara for the first time, a cruel smirk twisting his lips. "What's a woman like you going to do with cinnamon, trying to sweeten a sour bargain?" The insult hung in the air, sharp and poisonous. The other customers in the store, 2 ranch hands and a farmer's wife, stopped and stared, their faces a mixture of shock and cruel anticipation. Clara felt as if all the air had been punched from her lungs. She wanted to disappear, to dissolve into the floorboards. And then Silas moved. He didn't shout, he didn't raise a hand. He simply took one step forward, placing himself between Clara and the counter. His immense shadow fell over Mr. Davies, seeming to swallow the smaller man whole. The temperature in the store seemed to drop by 20 degrees. When Silas spoke, his voice was not loud. It was a low, gravelly rumble, the sound of rocks grinding together deep underground, a sound of immense and terrible pressure. "My wife," he said, the 2 words dropping into the silence like stones into a deep well, "is making her purchases. You will weigh what she has selected. You will wrap it. And you will not speak again unless you are answering a direct question from her." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "Do you understand me?" The word wife was a thunderclap. It was a claim, a shield, a wall. It redefined her in an instant, not just to the smirking man behind the counter, but to everyone in the room, and perhaps, most of all, to herself. Mr. Davies's smirk vanished, replaced by a pasty, slack-jawed fear. He nodded dumbly, his eyes wide. He fumbled with the cinnamon tin, his hands shaking as he wrapped it in brown paper. He worked in a terrified silence, a silence mirrored by everyone else in the store. The only sounds were the rustle of paper and the clink of coins as Silas paid. The ride home was a torment of a different kind. The charged, hostile silence of the store had followed them, settling over the wagon seat. Clara sat rigid, her hands clenched so tightly in her lap her knuckles were white. She stared straight ahead, at the endless, dusty road. but all she could see was the sneer on Mr. Davies's face. All she could hear was Silas's voice saying that impossible word, wife. He had defended her. He had stood for her. And in doing so, he had chained her more tightly to him, made her more of a burden, the cause of his conflict with the town that already shunned him. When they reached the ranch, she didn't wait for him to help her down. Before the wagon had even come to a complete stop, she scrambled down, her legs unsteady. She didn't go to the house. She fled, running past the porch, past the well, seeking the only place that felt as broken and desolate as she did. She ran to the back of the new barn, the one he never entered, and collapsed in the long, dead grass of its shadow. And there, the composure she had so carefully maintained for a lifetime finally shattered. The tears came, hot and furious. They were not the quiet, dignified tears of sorrow. They were the wrenching, ragged sobs of a soul pushed past its limit. She wept for the humiliation in the store, for the shame of her scar, for the cruelty of a world that saw her as less than whole. She wept for the foster father who had taught her she was worthless, and for the fire that had marked her as a survivor but also as a perpetual outcast. And most of all, she wept because the one man who had shown her a measure of decency was now paying the price for it. And she was the cause. She didn't know how long she cried, her body shaking, her throat raw. She was so lost in her storm of grief that she didn't hear his approach until his shadow fell over her. She looked up, her vision blurred with tears, and saw him standing there, his face unreadable, his large frame blocking out the sky. She flinched, expecting anger, or perhaps a weary resignation. He did not speak. He simply stood there for a long moment, looking down at her, a great, silent mountain of a man. Then, he did something she would never have expected. He lowered himself, his knees cracking, and knelt in the dusty grass in front of her. He knelt, bringing his face level with hers, an act of such profound, gentle humility it stole her breath. He reached out, his large, calloused hand hovering for a moment before it settled over her own, still clenched in the fabric of her dress. His touch was warm and firm, a steady anchor in her swirling sea of despair. When he finally spoke, his voice was a raw, quiet whisper, meant only for her. "I don't need you to be beautiful, Clara." His thumb moved, a slow, comforting stroke over her knuckles. "I just need you to be here." His words were a balm on a wound she hadn't known was still bleeding. He wasn't absolving her of a crime. He was affirming her existence. Her value to him was not in her appearance, not in what she could offer, but simply in her presence. In this place, with him. The storm of her sobbing subsided into quiet, shuddering breaths. She looked up at him through her tear-spiked lashes, seeing him for the first time not as a giant or a mystery or a man of sorrows, but simply as Silas, a man who had knelt in the dirt for her, a man who had called her his wife, a man who needed her to just be. And for the first time in her life, a genuine smile touched Clara's lips. It wasn't a large smile. It was a small, fragile, watery thing, like the first wildflower pushing its way through a late snow. But it was real, and it reached her eyes, transforming her tear-stained face with a light he had never seen before. The sight of it struck Silas with a physical force. It was a sharp, piercing ache in the center of his chest, a feeling so foreign and intense it almost made him gasp. It wasn't the dull, familiar ache of grief. It was something else entirely, something bright and painful and full of a terrifying, breathtaking hope. It was the feeling of a heart, long thought dead and buried, giving a single, powerful beat. He rose to his feet and helped her up. They stood there for a moment, his hand still covering hers. No more words were needed. He turned and began to walk toward the house, and she fell into step beside him. They walked together, in a silence that was no longer empty, nor tense, nor even contemplative. but full of a quiet, trembling, and deeply profound emotion. And the house, waiting for them in the fading light, looked less like a shelter from the world, and more like a place to begin one. The smile, that small, fragile, water on the verge of breaking smile, was a crack in the dam of Silas's carefully constructed world. In the days that followed their trip to town, something had irrevocably shifted between them. The space in the house, once filled with the echoing silence of grief and caution, now hummed with a different kind of quiet. It was a silence of anticipation, of awareness. When they passed in the narrow hallway, their shoulders would nearly brush, and a current, potent and unnerving, would pass between them. He found his eyes drawn to her more often, to the graceful, efficient movements of her hands as she kneaded dough, the focused line of her brow as she stitched a seam, the way a loose strand of dark hair would escape her bun and curl against the pale skin of her neck. And Clara, in turn, found herself watching him. She saw past the intimidating size, past the fortress of his silence. To the small things, she saw the way his shoulders, usually held so rigid, would relax just a fraction when he sat down to the simple supper she'd prepared. She heard the change in the sound of his footsteps on the porch at the end of the day, a heavy, weary tread giving way to something that was almost, but not quite, light. The word he had used in the store, wife, reverberated in the quiet spaces of her mind. It was a shield he had given her, but it was also a key, one that had unlocked a door inside her she had thought long since bricked over. One late afternoon, the sun slanting low and turning the dust motes in the air to flecks of gold, Clara found herself in need of a length of sturdy wire. She wanted to build a small trellis for the bean shoots that were just beginning to push their way through the dark soil of her garden. She had searched the main barn and the lean-to where he kept the blacksmithing tools, but had found nothing suitable. There was one last place to look, a small, dilapidated shed attached to the far side of the barn, a place she had seen him approach but never enter. It seemed to sag under the weight of its own disuse, its door held shut by a simple wooden latch. Hesitantly, she approached it. It felt like a transgression, a crossing of one of his invisible but fiercely guarded boundaries. But the need for the wire was a practical, tangible thing, and she was a practical woman. Taking a shallow breath, she lifted the latch. The door protested with a long, agonized creak, opening into a square of dusty darkness. She stepped inside, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. The air was thick and stale, heavy with the scent of dry rot, ancient dust, and the faint, ghostly perfume of something else. Dried lavender, perhaps, a scent long since faded to a mere memory. The place was not a workshop. It was a storeroom, a tomb for forgotten things. Old furniture stood shrouded in dusty canvas. A spinning wheel sat in a corner with a broken treadle, and a stack of mildewed books leaned precariously against a wall. On a low shelf, tucked away behind a stack of empty canning jars, was a small, leather-bound trunk, no bigger than her carpet bag. It was not covered in the same thick layer of dust as everything else. A small, clean patch on the lid suggested it had been touched, if not opened, somewhat recently. A powerful curiosity, stronger than her caution, compelled her forward. She knelt and ran a hand over the worn leather. The brass latch was unlocked. Her fingers trembled slightly as she lifted the lid. The scent of lavender was stronger now, mixed with the faint, clean smell of cedar. Inside, nestled on a bed of yellowed linen, were the last remnants of a life cut short. The first thing she saw was a dress. It was made of a simple, pale blue calico, dotted with tiny white flowers. It was a happy dress, a dress for a summer picnic or a Sunday social. But a dark, terrible stain marred its beauty. The hem and one of the delicate, puffed sleeves were scorched black, the fabric brittle and crumbling, a stark and horrifying testament to the fire. Clara felt a cold dread wash over her. This was not just a dress, it was an artifact of a tragedy. Beneath the dress was a small, ribbon-tied bundle of letters. She carefully lifted them out. One, on top, was unfinished, lying open on a single sheet of paper. The handwriting was elegant, a series of graceful, looping letters. Asterisk, dearest sister, it began. Asterisk, the new foal is a wonder, a little filly, as black as midnight, and Thomas is utterly besotted. He has named her Starlight. Silas laughs at the fanciful name, but I see the way he watches the boy with his new pet, and his eyes are so full of pride. The ranch is hard work, as ever, but it is a good life. Silas is a good man, steady and strong. The letter ended there, the sentence unfinished, waiting for a conclusion that would never be written. Clara's throat tightened. She could see her, this woman, Eleanor, sitting at a table, writing this letter, her world full of the simple, profound joys of a foal, a son, and a strong husband. At the very bottom of the trunk, wrapped in a piece of soft flannel, was a small, heavy object. Clara unwrapped it. It was a daguerreotype in a tarnished silver frame. She angled it toward the thin shaft of light coming through the doorway. It was a portrait of a small boy, perhaps 5 years old. He was dressed in a stiff, formal-looking suit, his hair slicked down. He stared out from the silver plate with the solemn, unsmiling gravity of children in old photographs. But his eyes, large and dark like his father's, were alight with a fierce, untamable spark of mischief. Thomas, this was the boy who had named his horse Starlight. Clara stared at the image, her heart aching. She saw the ghost of Silas in the boy's stubborn chin, the echo of Eleanor in the gentle curve of his brow. She felt like a trespasser, a profaner of sacred ground. With a sense of profound reverence and sorrow, she carefully rewrapped the photograph, placed it back in the trunk, and laid the letter and the scorched dress on top. She was just lowering the lid when a shadow fell across the doorway. She looked up, her heart leaping into her throat. Silas stood there, his massive frame completely filling the entrance, plunging the small shed into near darkness. He said nothing. His face was a mask of stone, but his eyes, even in the dim light, seemed to burn with a cold, terrifying fire. He had seen her. He had seen the trunk open, the relics of his past in her hands. I was looking for some wire, she whispered, the words sounding flimsy and pathetic. A child's excuse. He did not seem to hear her. His gaze was fixed on the open trunk, on the scorched blue fabric that spilled over its edge. He took a step into the shed, and another. He moved with a slow, dreamlike quality, as if walking through deep water. He stopped beside her, towering over her kneeling form. The silence was absolute, broken only by the frantic, panicked beating of her own heart. She expected a roar of rage, an order to get out, a condemnation of her intrusion. Instead, a sound escaped him, a low, guttural noise, like an animal in pain. He slowly, deliberately, sank to his knees beside her, his large body seeming to fold in on itself. He stared into the trunk, his eyes tracing the burned edge of the dress. "I was mending a fence," he said, his voice a raw, broken whisper that seemed to be pulled from the very depths of his soul. "In the south pasture, I saw the smoke." He shook his head, a slow, tortured movement. "I ran. I've never run so hard in my life. The whole way. I told myself it was just a brush fire, a stray spark, not the barn." He reached a hand that trembled visibly, and touched the scorched fabric. His fingers recoiled as if burned anew. It was so fast, the roof had already fallen in. A support beam, rotten inside. The whole hayloft came down. He looked at Clara, but his eyes were seeing something else, a scene replaying in his mind for the 1,000th time. "The heat! Dear God, the heat! I tried to get in. I could hear the horses." His voice cracked. "But I couldn't hear them. Not Eleanor, not Thomas." He squeezed his eyes shut. his face contorting in an agony so profound it was difficult to look at. The sheriff had to pull me away. I fought him. I fought them all. I was strong enough to lift a wagon, strong enough to break a horse, strong enough for everything. But that— He opened his eyes, and they were swimming with a grief so raw, so naked, that it was like looking into an open wound. And then, the wall he had built around himself, the fortress of silence and solitude he had maintained for 3 long years, crumbled into dust. A single tear escaped, tracing a clean path through the grime on his cheek. It was followed by another and another. His broad shoulders began to shake. The sobs that escaped him were not the clean, wet sounds of simple sadness. They were the dry, ragged, tearing sounds of a man who had forgotten how to cry. The sound of a grief so old and impacted it had to break him to get out. He buried his face in his hands, his whole body racked with a storm of sorrow that had been brewing for 1,000 silent days and nights. Clara's own fear and trepidation vanished, washed away by a powerful, overwhelming wave of pure compassion. She didn't think, she acted. She reached out and placed a hand on his shaking shoulder. It was a small gesture, her small hand almost lost on the vast, trembling expanse of his back. He didn't seem to notice, so she did more. She shifted closer, and with a courage she didn't know she possessed, she leaned into him, resting her head against his chest. She could feel the violent shuddering of his sobs, hear the raw, broken sounds tearing from his throat. She said nothing. What words could possibly suffice? She simply held on, offering her own small, steady presence as an anchor in his maelstrom of pain. After a long moment, he seemed to become aware of her. His hands came away from his face, and his arms came around her, pulling her close. It was not a gesture of tenderness or romance. It was a desperate, instinctual act, the reflexive clutch of a drowning man reaching for a piece of driftwood. He held her tightly, burying his face in her hair, and wept until the storm finally, exhaustingly, passed, leaving in its wake a profound, shattered, and utterly transformed silence. They stayed like that for a long time, kneeling on the dusty floor of the shed, surrounded by ghosts. When he finally stirred, he did not release her immediately. He simply loosened his grip, his breathing still ragged. He helped her to her feet, and then rose himself, moving like a very old man. Without a word, he gently closed the lid of the trunk. He did not latch it. He turned and walked out of the shed, into the fading light of evening, and she followed. That night, a chill wind blew down from the mountains. Silas built a fire in the hearth, the same hearth where they had sat during the rainstorm, but the atmosphere was entirely different. The air was charged, fragile, almost reverent. He had been stripped bare, his deepest wound exposed, and she had been the one to witness it, to offer comfort. The barrier of his grief, the wall that had defined the space between them, was gone. They sat in their usual chairs, but the distance between them felt different. It was no longer a gulf, but a space humming with a powerful, unspoken current. The firelight danced on their faces, illuminating the tear tracks still faintly visible on his cheeks, and the profound, empathetic sorrow in her eyes. He looked at her, truly looked at her. For the first time, he saw not just the survivor, not just the quiet, competent woman who ran his house. He saw the person who had not run from his pain, but had leaned into it. He saw a strength that had nothing to do with physical labor and everything to do with the resilience of the human heart. Slowly, as if in a trance, he reached across the space between them. His hand, large and rough, came to rest on the arm of her chair. His fingers were just an inch from her own. She did not pull away. After a moment of hesitation, she uncurled her fingers and laid her hand lightly on top of his. His skin was calloused and warm. He turned his hand over and laced his fingers with hers. It was an act of profound intimacy, a connection more powerful than any words. He rose from his chair and knelt before her. just as he had done by the barn. He held her hand in both of his, lifting it to his lips and pressing a gentle, reverent kiss to her knuckles. Then, with infinite slowness, he released her hand and reached up, his fingers tracing the silvery, jagged line of the scar on her cheek. He did not flinch. His touch was as light as a moth's wing, a gesture not of pity, but of exploration, of acceptance. He was tracing the map of her survival. She closed her eyes at his touch, a shiver running through her, and she, in turn, reached up, her hand touching his face, her fingers sinking into the rough softness of his beard, feeling the weary lines etched around his eyes. It was a silent, mutual acknowledgement of all the pain, all the scars, both seen and unseen. He leaned in, and his lips met hers. The kiss was not one of passion or of pent-up desire. It was a gentle collision, a tentative, questioning touch. It tasted of salt, of wood smoke, and of a loneliness so profound it was almost a physical thing. It was slow and awkward and deeply, achingly beautiful. It was the kiss of two blind people, fumbling in the darkness, who had just discovered the existence of light. It was not a moment of carnal hunger. It was a deeper, more elemental need that drew them together. It was the hunger to be seen, to be held, to be recognized as a living, breathing soul after years of being treated as a ghost or a monster. It was the desperate, unspoken desire of two survivors, standing on the shore after a great and terrible shipwreck, finally reaching for each other, not for pleasure, but for the simple, miraculous affirmation of life itself. The season turned. The raw, open wound of their shared pasts had been lanced, and in the quiet, tender space that followed, something new began to grow. It was as if the land itself felt the shift. The rains that had come with the storm had been a blessing, sinking deep into the thirsty earth. The pastures, once a patchwork of brown and pale yellow, took on a soft, greenish hue. In Clara's garden, the bean shoots climbed their new trellises with a tenacious vigor, and the potato plants grew thick and lush. Life settled into a rhythm that was no longer defined by caution, but by a quiet, burgeoning contentment. Mornings were filled with the scent of brewing coffee and the comfortable sounds of a shared home. Silas's old gray horse, Gideon, sired a foal, a long-legged, clumsy creature that brought a rare, genuine smile to Silas's face. A pair of barn swallows built a mud and grass nest in the eaves of the porch, and their cheerful, chattering songs became the soundtrack to the long, sun-drenched afternoons. The space between Silas and Clara had transformed. The awkward distances were gone, replaced by an easy proximity, a casual touch as they passed in the kitchen, his hand brushing her back, a shared glance over the supper table that spoke volumes more than words ever could. He had told her the story of his ghosts, and she had not fled. She had held him through the storm of his grief, and in doing so, she had anchored him back to the world of the living. For Clara, the constant, gnawing fear that had been her lifelong companion had receded. She had found not just safety in this desolate place, but a sense of belonging she had never dared to imagine. She was no longer just a survivor. She was beginning to live. This fragile, beautiful peace was shattered on a Tuesday. The mail rider, a lanky youth named Jebediah, stopped at the end of their road as he did every other week. Clara walked down the long, dusty track to meet him, a small basket of fresh eggs in her hand as a trade for a newspaper. Jebediah handed her the paper and a single, thin letter. "This one's for you, ma'am," he said, tipping his hat. Clara looked at the envelope. It was addressed to Clara, with no last name. Care of the Redemption Post Office. The return address was simply a street in St. Louis. The handwriting was a cramped, spidery scrawl, a script that sent a bolt of pure, cold ice through her veins. She knew that handwriting. She had been forced to copy it in endless, punishing lessons as a child. Her heart began to pound against her ribs. A frantic, trapped bird. She thanked Jebediah, her voice a strained whisper, and waited until his horse was a distant plume of dust before she dared to open it. Her hands were shaking so badly she tore the envelope. The single sheet of paper inside felt venomous to the touch. The letter was not from her foster father, Mr. Finch. It was from a woman who had been their neighbor, a nosy, gossiping creature named Martha. But it was about him. Asterisk Clara. Asterisk it began, with no pleasantries. Asterisk, I thought it my Christian duty to inform you that Mr. Finch has been released from the state penitentiary. His sentence was shortened for good behavior. He has been asking after you. He tells everyone that you are like a daughter to him and that he worries for your welfare. He says he intends to find you, to make sure you are safe and cared for. I do not know where you have gone, but I am sending this to the last address the agency had, in the hopes that you receive this warning. The world tilted on its axis. The cheerful chattering of the swallows faded into a dull roar in her ears. The warm sun felt suddenly cold on her skin. He's out. He's looking for me. The words were a death knell. She knew what his concern meant. He was not a father figure. He was her tormentor, the man whose drunken rage had nearly killed her, the man whose shadow had haunted every day of her life. He was the reason she believed herself to be cursed, a magnet for trouble and pain. A wave of nausea and terror so profound it buckled her knees washed over her. She stumbled, catching herself on a fence post, the rough wood digging into her palm. She had been a fool to believe she could ever escape, a fool to build a life, a fool to bring her poisoned past to the door of a good man who had already suffered enough. She ran back to the house, the letter clutched in her hand, her breath coming in ragged, panicked sobs. Silas was in the barn, mending a harness. He looked up as she burst in, his face etched with concern at the sight of her colorless cheeks and wild eyes. "Clara, what is it?" She couldn't speak. She just held out the shaking piece of paper. He took it from her, his brow furrowed in confusion. He read it slowly, his lips moving almost imperceptibly. As he absorbed the words, a change came over him. The concern in his face hardened, line by line, into a mask of cold, dangerous fury. The air in the barn grew thick and heavy. "It's him!" she finally managed to choke out, her voice trembling. "He'll find me. He'll find asterisk us asterisk. Silas, I have to go. I can't bring this here. I won't be the reason your life is ruined again." The words poured out of her, a torrent of fear and self-loathing. "I am a calamity. I bring disaster wherever I go. Please, you have to let me leave before he comes." She turned to flee, to pack her meager belongings, to disappear back into the lonely, anonymous world she had come from. But Silas's hand shot out, his fingers wrapping around her arm. His grip was not painful, but it was as unyielding as iron. He turned her to face him, his gray eyes blazing with an intensity that stunned her into silence. "No," he said, and the word was not a request. It was a roar, a low, guttural sound that seemed to vibrate through the very timbers of the barn. He pulled her closer, his other hand coming up to cup her face, his thumb stroking away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. "You are not a calamity," he growled, his voice thick with a ferocious protectiveness she had never heard before. "You are my wife. This is your home." He looked down at her, his gaze unwavering, and the fire in his eyes was for her, not at her. "Let him come. Let him try. No one touches you while you are here. No one." The next morning, he hitched the wagon. He did not ask her to come. He told her. They rode into redemption. Not as a man and his mail-order bride, but as a united front. The townsfolk still stared, but there was a new quality to their glances. The story of Silas's defense of Clara in the general store had become local legend. They were no longer just a curiosity. They were a force. Silas bypassed the general store and the saloon, heading straight for a small, neat building with a shingle that read, *Arthur Wallace, attorney at law *. He left Clara on the wagon and went inside. She waited, her hands twisting in her lap, her heart a frantic drum. He was inside for nearly an hour. When he came out, he carried a sheaf of official-looking papers. He climbed back onto the wagon seat, his face set with grim determination. He drove them to the edge of town, to the small, dusty office of the circuit judge, a man named Potter. Again, Silas went in alone. This time, he was gone for only a few minutes. When he returned, he looked at her, and the hard lines on his face had softened. "It's done," he said quietly. "We're married, properly, according to the laws of this territory." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, simple, unadorned gold band. "I should have done this the day you arrived." That evening, they did not have a ceremony in a church. Their chapel was the small garden Clara had coaxed from the stubborn earth. Their witnesses were the setting sun, the sighing wind, and the chattering swallows on the roof. Standing between the rows of thriving bean plants, Silas took her hand. It was trembling. "I don't have pretty words. Clara," he said, his voice rough with emotion as he slid the gold band onto her finger. It was a little too large, but it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. "I can't promise you a life of ease. This land is hard. Life is hard. But I promise you this, I will stand between you and all harm. I will honor you and protect you. I will be your home, always." Tears streamed freely down her face, but for the first time in her life, they were tears not of sorrow or fear, but of a joy so profound it was painful. She had no ring for him, nothing to give but the promise she whispered back to him on the evening breeze. "And I will be your home, Silas, always." He sealed his vow with a kiss that was not one of tentative discovery, but of deep, abiding certainty. It was a kiss of commitment, of belonging, of two solitary souls forging a single fortress against the world. The waiting was the worst part. For 3 nights, they lived on a knife's edge. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind in the grass, sent a jolt of fear through Clara. Silas became a sentry. He cleaned and oiled his rifle. Keeping it by the door, he rarely spoke, but his presence was a constant, reassuring weight. He was a mountain, and she was sheltered in his shadow. Then, on the 4th night, he came. A dog's frantic barking from the neighboring Henderson ranch was the first warning. Silas was instantly alert. He rose from his chair, motioning for Clara to stay away from the windows. He took the rifle, his movements silent and economical. He stood by the door, a great, still shadow in the lamplight. Then they heard it, the sound of a horse moving slowly, cautiously, up their road. The footsteps stopped. There was a long, tense silence. Then, a man's voice, thin and reedy, with a wheedling tone she remembered with a sickening lurch of her stomach, cut through the night. "Clara? Little Clarabelle? I know you're in there. Your old guardian is here. I've come a long, long way to find you." It was Finch. "Go to your room. Lock the door," Silas whispered, his voice dangerously low. She did as she was told, her limbs feeling like lead. She pressed her ear to the door, her body shaking uncontrollably. She heard the front door open. "She's not here," Silas's voice boomed, deep and final. "Now, there's no need for unpleasantness." Finch's oily voice replied, "I'm sure she's just frightened. She was always a timid little thing. I have legal papers. Guardianship. She belongs with me." "She belongs here," Silas stated. "You have 10 seconds to get back on your horse and ride away from my land." There was a scuffling sound, a sudden curse from Finch. "Get your hands off me, you oversized ape!" And then all hell broke loose. Clara heard a thud, a cry of pain, the splintering of wood. She couldn't stay hidden. She flung her door open. In the moonlight streaming through the open doorway, she saw a terrible tableau. Finch was a small, wiry man, but he had a knife. He had lunged at Silas, who had caught his wrist, but not before the blade had sliced a deep, ragged gash in Silas's left forearm. Blood, dark in the moonlight, welled and dripped onto the floorboards. The sight of Silas's blood, shed for her, broke something in Clara, but it was the sight of Silas's face that truly terrified her. It was a mask of pure, primal rage. The quiet, grieving man was gone, replaced by a force of nature, with a roar that was not human. He twisted the knife from Finch's grip, the man's wrist snapping with an audible crack. He threw the knife away and lifted Finch off the ground by the front of his shirt, shaking him like a rat. The fight was over before it had truly begun. Silas was simply too big, too strong, too full of righteous fury. He threw Finch out the door, where he landed in a crumpled heap in the dust. By now, the noise had attracted attention. A lantern bobbed in the distance. Mr. Henderson, carrying a shotgun. The ordeal was over. The sheriff was sent for. Finch, groaning and clutching his broken wrist, was tied up and taken away. But as the immediate danger passed, the full weight of the night crashed down on Clara. She looked at the blood on the floor, at the deep gash in Silas's arm, at the wreckage of a chair that had been overturned in the struggle. This was her fault. The violence, the blood, the terror. She had brought it all here. She was a curse. Her legs gave way, and she slid down the wall, collapsing into a heap on the floor, the world dissolving into a black, roaring tunnel. When she came to, she was in their bed. A cool, damp cloth was on her forehead. Silas was sitting in a chair beside her, his arm tightly bandaged. His face was pale from blood loss, but his eyes were clear and focused entirely on her. "Silas," she whispered, the guilt of physical sickness in her throat. "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I've brought you nothing but trouble." He reached out his good hand. Taking hers, his grip was steady and warm. He looked at her, and in his eyes, she saw no anger, no regret, no blame, only a deep, unwavering, and utterly overwhelming love. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but the words were the strongest, most powerful ones she had ever heard. "Clara," he said, his gaze holding hers, "that man was not trouble. He was a nuisance. The 3 years I spent alone in this house, listening to ghosts. That asterisk was trouble." He squeezed her hand. "You are not a calamity. You are not a curse." He leaned closer, his face softening with a tenderness that made her heart ache. "You, Clara," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "are the best thing that has ever happened to me." Silas's words were a foundation. In the quiet days that followed the violent intrusion of her past, Clara felt a profound and fundamental shift within herself. He had not only defended her body, he had healed her soul. The fear that had lived in her bones for so long, the corrosive belief that she was a vessel of misfortune, had been replaced by the simple, unshakable truth of his love. Asterisk. "You are the best thing that has ever happened to me." The words had become her bedrock, a place from which she could finally, truly, begin to build. The physical wound on Silas's arm healed, leaving a clean, pale scar that matched the one on her own face. They were a pair, marked by the battles they had fought for each other. But Clara knew that a deeper healing was still required. It was not enough to be safe within the confines of the ranch. To be truly free, she could no longer hide from the world. She had to walk back into it, not as the timid, scarred creature who had arrived on the train, but as Clara, Silas's wife. One Sunday morning, she made her decision. She dressed in her best, mended dress, pinned her hair with meticulous care, and met Silas at the door. "I am going into town," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "To the church?" He looked at her, his gray eyes searching her face. He saw no fear there, only a calm resolve. He simply nodded. "I'll hitch the wagon." "No," she said gently. "This is something I must do alone. He understood. He watched her walk down the long road, a small, solitary figure filled with a strength that belied her size, and his heart swelled with a pride so fierce it was almost painful. The town of Redemption fell into its usual hush as she walked its single dusty street. The stares still followed her, but Clara met them differently now. She did not fix her gaze on the horizon. She looked directly at the faces, offering a small, polite nod to those she passed. She was no longer a frightened refugee. She was a resident. She was home. Her destination was the small, whitewashed church at the end of the street. It was here, in this house of God, that she had been most keenly judged. She remembered the whispers, the cold shoulders. She pushed open the heavy wooden door and stepped inside. The service was over, but the minister's wife, a stern, hawk-nosed woman named Mrs. Albright, was tidying hymnals at the front. She looked up, her expression a mixture of surprise and disapproval. "Can I help you?" Mrs. Albright asked, her tone frosty. "I hope so," Clara replied, her voice steady. She walked down the central aisle, her soft footsteps the only sound in the quiet space. "I am Clara, Silas's wife." She said the words with a simple, unadorned dignity. "I have heard that the church cares for the orphans from the county, children who have lost their families." Mrs. Albright's eyes narrowed. "We do. It is our Christian duty. They are a handful, I assure you." "I would like to volunteer my time," Clara said, "to help care for them, to read to them, or mend their clothes. Whatever is needed." The minister's wife was taken aback, her disapproval momentarily giving way to disbelief. "You? Why would you want to do that?" The unspoken question hung in the air between them. Asterisk. Why would a creature like you want to be around children? Clara looked at the older woman, and for the first time, Mrs. Albright saw past the scar to the profound, quiet sorrow and strength in her eyes. "Because I know what it is to be alone," Clara said softly. "And I believe children who have been through hardship need a quiet hand and a patient heart, not a judgmental eye. I have a quiet hand." Her words, so simple and sincere, disarmed the other woman completely. Mrs. Albright looked at Clara for a long, silent moment. She saw no guile, no hidden motive. She saw only an honest, heartfelt offer. Her stern features softened. "Just a fraction. They come on Wednesdays," she said, her voice losing some of its icy edge. "Be here at 9 o'clock. And so," Clara began, "every Wednesday, she would walk into town and spend the day at the small parish house behind the church where the half-dozen orphans were cared for. At first, the children were wary. They, too, had heard the stories of the giant's scarred wife. They stared at her face with the unfiltered curiosity of the young. Clara did not flinch. She simply smiled her small, gentle smile and sat down on a low stool, a basket of mending in her lap. She did not force herself upon them. She was just there, a calm, quiet presence. It was a little girl named Sarah, a child of 6 with eyes as sad and old as a winter sky, who broke the ice. She had a doll whose cloth arm was nearly torn off. After watching Clara for an hour, she shyly approached and held the doll out. Clara took it, threaded a needle, and with her small, neat stitches, she made the doll whole again. When she handed it back, Sarah looked from the mended doll to Clara's face, and then she reached out a tiny finger and gently, tentatively, touched the scar on Clara's cheek. "Does it hurt?" Sarah whispered. "Not anymore," Clara replied softly. "It's just a part of my story." From that day on, the wall was broken. The children, free from the prejudices of their elders, saw only her kindness. They began to flock to her, drawn by her gentle voice and her infinite patience. She read them stories, her voice bringing to life tales of brave knights and enchanted forests. She taught them to bake, their small hands covered in flour. She showed them how to make dolls from corn husks, She was not a figure of pity or fear. She was simply Miss Clara. The town, in turn, began to see her through the children's eyes. They saw her walking down the street, a small child holding tightly to each of her hands, their faces upturned to her in adoration. They heard the stories from Mrs. Albright, whose grudging respect had blossomed into genuine admiration. The narrative began to shift. The whispers did not die, but they changed their tune. "Did you see Silas's wife with the orphans? She has the patience of a saint." Henderson said Silas fought off that drifter to protect her. A man wouldn't do that for just anyone. One Wednesday, Mrs. Albright asked if the children could have a picnic. "They're so cooped up here," she said. "They'd love a trip to the country." "They can come to our ranch," Clara offered without hesitation. And so, the children came. Silas, at first, was a figure of awe and terror to them. This giant of a man, who they had only heard about in hushed tones, was a mountain in their path. He stood awkwardly on the porch as they tumbled out of the wagon, his big hands looking lost and out of place. But then a small boy, no older than 4, tripped on a stone and fell, skinning his knee, before anyone else could move. Silas was there, kneeling in the dirt, his enormous frame seeming to shrink as he gently examined the small wound. He lifted the boy up as if he weighed no more than a feather and carried him inside to be patched up by Clara. That was all it took. The fear vanished, replaced by a boundless fascination. They followed him everywhere. They asked him to lift them onto Gideon's back. They shrieked with delight when he showed them the new foal. They peppered him with 1,000 questions. He was no longer Mad Silas's or the giant of Redemption Ridges. To them, he was the kind giant, a name that soon caught on with the rest of the town. Their ranch, once a place of haunted isolation, became a haven of life and laughter. The sound of children's voices filled the air, a sound Silas had thought he would never hear on his land again. He would watch Clara in the center of it all, a small, serene sun with a constellation of children orbiting around her, and he would feel a sense of peace so profound it was almost overwhelming. She had not only brought life back to him, she had brought it back to his home. One afternoon, after the children had left, leaving a wake of happy exhaustion behind them, Silas watched Clara as she knelt in her garden, tending to the wildflowers she had transplanted from the surrounding hills. She worked with such loving care, her hands gentle on the delicate stems. He saw in that small patch of cultivated beauty a reflection of her own soul, something lovely and resilient that had managed to bloom in the harshest of environments. And an idea took root in his mind. For the next 2 weeks, he worked on a secret project. He used the lumber from an old, collapsed line shack and salvaged panes of glass he had ordered from a town 50 miles away. He worked with a focused, silent intensity, his bandaged arm a testament to the reason behind his labor. Clara, respecting his privacy, did not ask what he was building behind the barn. Then, one evening, he took her by the hand. "I have something for you," he said. He led her around the barn. There, gleaming in the soft light of the setting sun, was a small greenhouse. It was a simple, sturdy structure, its wooden frame strong, its glass panes reflecting the brilliant colors of the sky. It was a house of light. Clara stopped, her hand flying to her mouth. Tears welled in her eyes. It was the most beautiful, most thoughtful gift she had ever received. It was a sanctuary, a promise, a place where fragile things could grow, protected and cherished. She spent the next days joyfully transplanting her wildflowers into the greenhouse. There were Indian paintbrushes, delicate bluebells, and the sunny, cheerful faces of black-eyed Susans. It became her haven, a place of warmth and life and color. A week later, the first of the bluebells opened. It was a single, perfect blossom, its color as deep and clear as a mountain lake. That evening, as the last rays of sun streamed through the glass, turning the small space into a jewel box, Clara stood with Silas, admiring it. She reached out and touched the delicate petals with the tip of one finger. I survived, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, so quiet he had to lean in to hear her. All of it, the hunger, the cold, the fire. I think I survived for this moment. He said nothing, simply wrapping his arm around her waist and pulling her close. They stood in a comfortable silence, watching as the light faded, the scent of damp earth and blossoms filling the air. The moment was so perfect, so full of a peace she had never thought possible, that it gave her the courage to ask the one question that still lived in a small, dark corner of her heart. She turned in his arms to face him. She slowly lifted a hand and laid it against her own cheek, her fingers tracing the familiar, jagged path of her scar. Her eyes, full of a lifetime of vulnerability, met his. Silas, she asked, her voice barely a whisper, do you find me ugly? He looked at her, his expression softening with a tenderness that seemed to radiate from him like warmth from a fire. He did not answer with words. He lowered his head and pressed a soft, lingering kiss directly onto the scar. He kissed the damaged skin, the place of her deepest shame and pain, with a reverence that was almost a prayer. He was not erasing it, he was honoring it. When he finally lifted his head, his gray eyes were shining. When I look at this, Clara, he said, his voice a low, gentle rumble as he brushed his thumb over the path his lips had just followed. I don't see ugly. He looked directly into her eyes, and in their depths. She finally saw her true reflection. I see courage, he said softly. I see everything you endured to get here, to get to me. He paused, his other hand coming up to cup her face, his gaze holding hers with a love so absolute it took her breath away. And I want to grow old with you. A year passed. The seasons turned in their great, slow wheel, each one leaving its mark on the land and on the two souls who called it home. The harsh white of winter gave way to the tender green of spring, which in turn deepened into the sun-drenched gold of summer, and finally mellowed into the russet and amber of autumn. The ranch was no longer a place of silence and echoes. It breathed with a new rhythm, a rhythm of life. Clara's garden overflowed its borders, a riot of vegetables and herbs. The new foal grew strong and fleet-footed. The swallows returned to their nest on the porch, raising another brood of chattering, cheerful children. The love between Silas and Clara was a quiet, deep-rooted thing, like the ancient ponderosa pine on the hill. It needed no grand declarations. It lived in the small, daily acts of care. It was in the way he would leave a bucket of fresh, cool well water on the porch for her on a hot afternoon, and in the way she would have a hot cup of coffee waiting for him at dawn. It was in a shared look, a brief touch, a comfortable silence filled not with ghosts, but with a profound and abiding peace. Then, in the late spring, as the wildflowers in the greenhouse began to push their colorful heads toward the sun, Clara noticed a change within herself, a strange lethargy in the mornings, a new and tender fullness in her body. The realization dawned slowly, a quiet, breathtaking sunrise in her heart. She waited until she was certain, until the first faint, butterfly flutter of new life deep within her. She found Silas that evening, sitting under his pine tree. Though his vigil was different now, he was no longer a man communing with his grief, but a man watching over his world. She sat beside him on the large, flat rock, leaning her head against his solid shoulder. Silas, she began, her voice a soft murmur against the whisper of the wind. My garden will have a new bloom. Come winter. He was silent for a moment, absorbing her words, understanding their gentle metaphor. He turned his head, his rough beard brushing against her hair, and looked down at her. His eyes, so often stormy or veiled, were clear and filled with a light she had never seen before. Awe. He placed a hand, large and impossibly gentle, on her still flat abdomen. A new bloom, he repeated, his voice thick with emotion. Her joy, however, was tangled with a deep, primal fear. As the weeks turned into months and her body began to change, the fear grew. She had survived so much, but her body was a testament to that hardship. It was small and scarred, and had known hunger and cold more intimately than it had known comfort. Was she strong enough? Was this body, which had been so abused and neglected, whole enough to nurture a new life? The specter of childbirth in this remote, unforgiving land was a terrifying one. At night, she would lie awake, a hand on her swelling belly, and pray that she would be worthy of this miracle, that her broken past would not somehow mar this perfect, unwritten future. Silas, with the quiet intuition of a man who had learned to read the seasons and the sky, sensed her fear, and in response, the great, silent giant of Redemption Ridge transformed. A fierce and tender watchfulness settled over him. He became her shadow, her guardian, her unwavering protector. He forbade her from lifting anything heavier than a book. He took over the task of hauling water from the well, his own healing arm now strong enough for both of them. He would watch her eat, his brow furrowed with concern, silently urging another spoonful of stew, another slice of bread. His gentleness was a clumsy, beautiful thing. He, who had wrestled steers and broken wild horses, would now handle her as if she were the most fragile piece of porcelain. He would rub her aching back in the evenings, his huge, calloused hands moving with a surprising, innate tenderness. He would read to her from the old, mildewed books she had found in the shed, his low, rumbling voice a soothing balm to her frayed nerves. He was building a wall of care around her, brick by loving brick, a fortress to keep her fears at bay. He had failed to protect his family once. He seemed determined, with every fiber of his being, to not fail again. The winter came, blanketing the world in a pristine, silent white. The due date, according to the midwife in town, was near the end of January. As the time approached, the ranch became a quiet, expectant stage, a small wooden cradle, one Silas had built with his own hands from smooth, pale pine, sat by the hearth, waiting. And then, one night, the storm came. It arrived with the sudden, violent fury of a cornered animal. The wind howled around the corners of the house, a mournful, shrieking ghost. Sleet, as sharp as needles, lashed against the window panes. In the midst of this elemental chaos, Clara's labor began. It started as a low, persistent ache in her back, a tightening in her belly. At first, she said nothing, not wanting to send him out into the teeth of the blizzard. But as the pains grew stronger, closer, she knew they had no choice. Silas's face was a grim, determined mask when she told him. There was no panic, only action. He bundled her in every warm blanket they owned, stoked the fire until it roared in the hearth, and then pulled on his heaviest coat. "I'm going for Mrs. Gable," he said, his voice a calm anchor in the storm-tossed room. "Bar the door behind me. I will be back." She watched from the window as he led Gideon, now saddled, from the barn. Man and horse were swallowed by the swirling vortex of white in an instant. The world dissolved into a fury of wind and snow, and she was utterly alone. The pains were a relentless tide, pulling her under, then releasing her, each one stronger than the last. She clung to the edge of the bed, her knuckles white, her body a battleground. She thought of Silas, out in that maelstrom, and a fear colder than the storm itself gripped her. But then she thought of his promise, "I will be back," and she held on to it, a single point of light in the roaring darkness. The ride was a special kind of hell. Silas bent low over Gideon's neck, the wind tearing the breath from his lungs, the driving sleet freezing on his beard. The world was a blinding chaos of white. He could not see the road, he could only trust the horse, trust the animal's deep, instinctual knowledge of the land. It was a journey of faith. Every gust of wind, every slip of a hoof on the ice-slicked ground, was a test. The ghosts of the past whispered in the wind. taunting him with his old failure. Asterisk too slow. You will be too slow again. He grit his teeth, pushed the voices away, and urged the horse on. His one and only thought a prayer. Asterisk, let me be in time. Just let me be in time. It took him nearly 3 hours to cover the 10 miles to town. He pounded on the midwife's door. A great, snow-caked beast of a man. Mrs. Gable. A sturdy, no-nonsense woman who had seen more life and death than any 10 men. Took one look at his face and began to pack her bag. The journey back was even slower, with Mrs. Gable's small buggy struggling through the deepening drifts, when they finally saw the faint, welcoming light of the farmhouse. A sob of pure relief escaped Silas's throat. He burst through the door to find Clara on the bed, her face pale and beaded with sweat, but her eyes, when they met his, were full of a fierce, warrior's light. He did not hover in the background. He went to her. He knelt on the floor beside the bed, a position he had now taken twice before for her, a position of utter devotion. He took her hand, his large, warm grip an anchor in her sea of pain. For the rest of the long night, he did not move. Mrs. Gable worked with a brisk efficiency, offering words of encouragement, but Silas's presence was Clara's true strength. He whispered to her, his voice a low, steady murmur. He wiped her brow with a cool cloth. When the great earth-shattering waves of pain crested, she would squeeze his hand with a strength that would have crushed a smaller man's bones, and he would absorb it, taking her pain into himself, his face a mirror of her own struggle. In that primal, sacred space, they were not a man and a woman, but a single entity, working together to bring a new soul into the world. Just as the first gray hints of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, the storm outside finally broke, and with one last monumental effort, one last cry that was equal parts agony and triumph, their child was born. The first sound was a thin, reedy wail, a sound of such fierce, indignant life that it cut through the exhausted silence of the room. "It's a girl, Mrs." Gable announced, her voice soft with wonder. "A strong, healthy girl." She wrapped the baby in a clean, warm blanket and placed her in Clara's waiting arms. Clara looked down at the tiny, wrinkled, red-faced creature, at the thatch of dark hair, at the impossibly small, perfect fingers, and the world, with all its past pain and sorrow, simply fell away. There was only this new, miraculous life. She looked up at Silas, who was still kneeling beside her, his face a mess of tears and awe and a love so profound it was breathtaking. He reached out a trembling finger and gently touched the baby's cheek. The baby, in response, turned her head toward his touch. Clara leaned her head back against the pillows, her body aching and spent, but her heart so full it felt as if it might burst. She looked from her husband to her daughter, from the man who had been called a monster to the new life they had made together. "The daughter," she whispered, her voice a reedy thread of sound, "of those who were once called monsters." She looked down at the baby again, her gaze soft with an unshakable promise. "But she will grow up among flowers." The seasons turned once more. The snows melted. The creek swelled with rushing water, and the land was reborn in the tender green of spring. On a warm afternoon, they sat together under the great ponderosa pine on the hill. The world smelled of damp earth, new grass, and the sweet perfume of pine sap. The baby, swaddled in a soft wool blanket, slept soundly in Clara's arms, her small chest rising and falling in a steady, peaceful rhythm. Clara leaned against Silas, her head resting on his shoulder, utterly content. Silas looked at them. He looked at his wife, her scarred face serene and beautiful in the dappled sunlight, her eyes full of a quiet, deep-seated joy. He looked at his daughter, this perfect, innocent life, a testament not just to survival, but to a love that had bloomed in the most desolate of places. And for the first time since he had lost everything, A true smile touched Silas's lips. It was not a large thing. It was not a grin or a laugh. It was a slow, quiet, gentle curving of his mouth, as soft and certain as the first breath of spring after a long and brutal winter. The ice that had encased his heart for so long had finally, completely, melted away. The long winter of his grief was over. Thank you for listening to our story. We're so grateful to have you with us. We'd love to know where in the world you're listening from. So please leave a comment below and let's connect. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to our channel, From Wild West, and share your thoughts. Your support means the world to us.